Thank you, Erik, for this introduction, which is a very good description of the landscape of podcasting market in the United States. And podcast might be the future of radio. So we're going to have a discussion about advertising or subscription, which model for the podcast. And what is interesting in Stitcher's model is that you manage to charge people to listen to podcasts, which is something very new for us in France and in Europe also. So maybe you can begin and explain in detail your strategy at Stitcher to make people pay.
As awesome as those ads are that you heard, some people still hate ads. So we've discovered that people will pay for an entirely ad-free experience in the same way that they would pay for Netflix, they would pay for ad blockers or other kind of ad removal mechanisms. So that's part of the offering, is a purely ad-free experience. I think the second piece is we've discovered that there are podcasts that don't make sense as an ad-supported model. If you have a short-run show that's only a few episodes, if you have something that's scripted fiction, it can be very hard to introduce an ad into that environment, and people will pay for really high production quality shows that simply would not support ads. Then the final piece is there are a lot of people who they want to give money to the hosts of podcasts. They are so attached to the host, they love the host so much that they want to support them directly. And all those things, I think, are coming together to create a subscription model in the US.
And how much people are willing to pay for the...
We charge about $5 a month on a monthly basis. There are others charging around that price point. I think the highest that I've heard in the US is somebody coming out at about $8 a month. There are also other patronage models. There's a company called Patreon that allows people to directly support podcasters, and there the monthly price really varies pretty wildly.
Okay, thank you. Gabrielle Boeri-Charles, you are the co-founder and CEO of Binge Audio, which is in discussion with Les Echos to be bought by Les Echos and Le Parisien Group.
Yeah, not to be exactly both, but minority of capital.
So the French market is very different from the US one. In this market, podcasts essentially depend on advertising, like commercial TV. Your business model is based on brand content exclusively, and can you describe how you built this model?
Sure. Actually, today we have two sources of revenue at Binge Audio. First one is advertising or sponsorship, exactly the way you described it, actually. we copied a lot. And brand content. And advertising and sponsoring is working the same way as you mentioned, with high value allowed by good engagement from the audience, strong attachment, even emotional, with hosts and voices and contents, and scarcity of advertising, because the more value you have in podcasts, which is great because people listen with great attention to podcasts. They listen to most of the content. At Binge Audio, around 80% of each episode is listened to by people, which is great and very strong in comparison with other media, and especially online video, etc. And so the more value you have, the more scarcity you can apply to the advertising, and the more you can charge agencies and brands, and respecting the audience who is ready to accept advertising under the conditions that it does not changes the content so much. And the second revenue for Binge Audio, which is actually the majority of revenue today, is brand content. When we use what we are able to do in conception of podcasts, in production and in distribution for brands, institutions who want to share their values, their territories, their brands in an audio way.
So advertising on podcasts are really different from the kind of advertising you can have on radio.
Well, it's advertising, it's audio, but it's not, today at Binge Audio we allow only one brand per podcast, which means that you can have a better association in mind of audience between the brand and the podcast. And actually, I think that the ads are really good. They can be funny, most of them are host-read, they can be funny, they can be creative, they can bring knowledge and facts to the audience. So they are kind of useful and sometimes even pleasant for the audience. And I think that's different from today commercials on broadcast radio, yes.
Thank you. Matthieu Gallet, you used to be the president of Radio France, French public radio. You are now working on a new project which is called Majelan. It's going to be a kind of a French teacher. I think we can say say that. Why do you think it can work in France? And can you give some details of what you're working on?
So Majelan is a startup, a platform based on a model quite close to a Stitcher, with a free part and a subscription part. The free part is just financed by ads, and the subscription by subscribers. We will also have the possibility to have patronage also, because we see that in the US it's quite strong. It's strong also in other sectors like the video games. There's a lot of, if you look at Twitch, for instance. So we are very involved in this project to take all the good practices on the business, not only in the audio business, but also in other like video games, or on the experience. We want to create a new experience for the users, very close probably to Spotify. And in the meantime, the model is between Spotify and Netflix, because like Stitcher, there's a part which is free with ads, and there's a part for subscriptions to have original contents and to have a free ad experience for the subscriptions, because I think there's a place for new kind of ads, and what we listen to on Erik's presentation show us the difference between the traditional ads on the radio, and I'm sure Serge will talk about that, and also the new kind of ads you can have, like Binge has created in France. So
you're going to charge people to listen to podcasts?
Exactly.
What do you think? Why do you think that French people are ready for that? Because the market is totally new in France.
The market is not so new, because when you see what's happening in France with the podcasts for the last 4 or 5 years, or if I can speak about my experience at Radio France in 4 years, between 2014 and 2018, it was quadruple the numbers of downloading, because the question is, do people download and listen to, or is it, it's a question, and the real question, when you are based on Apple Podcasts, like you explained, that you don't have, it's very weak in the data, because Apple is not a company which is data-driven, or it's not presented like this. So it's a real question for the producers, for the podcasters, to have feedback on their datas, and if you compare with what YouTube made on the videos, you're very far from that on the Apple Podcast experience. So that's something, for us, it's a pain point in the present model, and we want to base our model also to this sharing of the data.
How much do you need to raise to launch such a podcast platform? I mean, we have a recent example, a company called Luminary Media that wants to be a global platform for podcasts, and it's recently raised $40 million from investor. What about
Maybe
you?
more than that.
More than that? More than how much? How many?
I don't know. I hear they're raising.
This is the official number. 40 million?
You know, you are in France, you are in Europe. So what I told you about my very recent experience as a startupper, it's the big difference between the US and Europe is the amount of money you can raise. So we will raise millions, but the US is still the US.
Sorry, can I jump in?
Yes.
On Luminary for a second? But you're talking about a freemium model where people can still listen for free. I think the reason that Luminary is raising so much capital is they are pursuing a pure paywall model where they are trying to take the show entirely behind a paywall. And for a lot of podcasters, the prospect of losing their entire audience, their entire free audience, and going to a much smaller audience, even though it's much more lucrative, a lot of podcasters are doing, and producers are doing other things. If they're the New York Times, they have a lot of other things going on, obviously. If they're somebody like Joe Rogan or some other comedian or celebrity, they've got an audience they want to serve above and beyond the podcast. And so suddenly paywalling that is a real problem for them. And Luminary needs to write much bigger checks to make that happen. And I think that's, frankly, they're raising money in the same way that Netflix raises money. They're paying outright for content. So it's a somewhat different model.
Because, what I have read, that their aim is to have 75% of original content within 3 years. So it's a huge amount. And when you see in the US to pay the producers like Oprah, it's unbelievable to put so much money, but it's Oprah, of course. You don't have Oprah Winfrey in France, so it's maybe our chance to have talents who are less expensive than Oprah Winfrey.
Serge Schick, you are working for Radio France. You're in charge of Radio France strategy and brand development. Radio France is one of the main players in Europe in podcast, with 60 million downloading each month. That's correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And so maybe my first question about Radio France is how did you build such a success? Because what is the profile of the audience of Radio France? Because on the public radio, we have all the idea that the audience is old. So what about podcast?
It's a wrong idea. I mean, to begin with, when you watch the average level of the people, it's around 50 on the traditional, on our traditional broadcasters, channels like France Inter and so on. But we are younger than the commercial radios, so it depends from your starting point. And of course, what is very interesting with the podcast is that we know that the profile of the broadcasters is younger. It's basically between 25 and 49. So for us, it's a way to renew or to reload our audiences. So it is a clear aim of our strategy in the podcasting area. So in fact, we have two goals. First of all, we want to increase the loyalty because we have amazing programs. We have amazing fans dealing with programs of sciences, philosophy, humor, and so on. So we know that we have great communities and we want to work on these communities. But on the other hand, it's a way to find new audiences And the native podcast will be a new way to reach these people. So
you were the first group in France, if as I know, to put pre-roll advertising on your podcast. What was the impact on the audience?
There was no impact. Or if there was an impact, the impact was positive, because the audiences didn't stop growing up. It was a discussion we had with Matthieu and 2 years ago when we decided to launch the advertising. Many people were saying you will lose your audiences, and it's not the case at all. So I think we just have one pre-roll, and that's all. So we don't want to embarrass people with advertising. And I must explain also why we decided to have advertising. First of all, the main reason was to cover the technical costs, because it's a random of the success. The more podcasts you have, the more band you need. And the other reason was to be able to create and to produce native podcasts. So with the money coming from advertising, we achieve to reach these two goals.
Okay, and so you only have advertising because Radio France is a public group, and you don't charge people, you don't make people pay for podcasts. It's not the philosophy, is it?
No, it's not the philosophy at all.
What will be the business model for the future? This business model only based on advertising, is it sustainable for the future? Because you have more and more content to finance.
Well, we are not exactly in the position of being a startup. Each year we raise money from the government. Each year it becomes more and more difficult, so we have to get some more revenues. So advertising on one hand, but in the future I'm sure that the business model will be different, and we are quite ready to explore some other ways. And for example, co-publishing will be, I think, one way of producing native podcasts. So we are not only focused on advertising, we are quite open to new ways of getting revenues.
Maybe, Gabrielle, on this question of to charge people for podcasts, are you thinking to have this kind of model, of business model?
Yes,
subscription?
Thinking about that. Today, it's not the case, but in the future, we plan to do so at some point. Not at this stage of our development, because we have much to do in the free business and with brand and advertising. But at a later stage, I think that people could be willing to pay if they have compelling content for that, especially fiction, strong narrative series, strong documentaries with high value, because traditionally audio and quality radio, especially with Radio France in France, is free. So and the offer is good actually. So if you want people to pay, you have to offer something with high value. I think it will be possible, and we plan to do so at some point, because actually the way people are thinking about paying for content is changing a lot. Today, even with young people, it can be cool to pay for great content. It can be Netflix, it can be other video content, but you have to have a great content and strong attachment to the brand, to the producers, to the voices. And what we are building at Binge Audio would be, I think, rewarding in that in the future.
Okay, thank you. Maybe we have a few questions. Yes?
Je vous apporte le micro, monsieur. Oui, bonjour. Puisqu'il y a quand même une forte antériorité de Radio France et puis d'Arte Radio sur la question des podcasts, quelle est la part de marché aujourd'hui de Radio France sur le marché français? Vous avez une idée, j'imagine?
Alors paradoxalement, je ne peux pas vous répondre, mais c'est pas parce que je ne veux pas vous répondre. Maybe I switch in English for my neighbor. I can't answer to your question because you don't have public data about the market. So with 60 million podcasts downloaded per month, we are sure that we are first in France, first in Europe, maybe one of the first in the world. I don't speak about platforms, but about editors or publishers. So we know that, for example, when we speak to Apple, we have a chance to speak to Apple. It means that we are quite big, I think. When we went in San Francisco 1 year and a half ago, they said that Radio France was representing 2 or 3% of all the amount of the podcast downloaded in the world. So I think that few elements to answer your question. I would like to answer more clearly to this question, but it's not yet the case.
I totally share the hope to have someday shared data about the market. To give you an idea of what Binge Audio is making today, it's almost 1 million downloads per month. So it gives you an idea. And after that, you have all the private radios and other podcast networks, of course.
Yes, I'll try in English. So with podcasts, we have something like proximity with the showrunner. And I think with the advertising, it will change the business and we can lose that. And it will become like more radio. We could not afford 2 hour and a half show. So how can we keep this proximity in podcast with the growth of the business?
I mean, I'll tell you, in the US, there's a risk of that. I think especially as platforms like, frankly, us and Pandora and others start to use pre-recorded ads in more traditional ad units, there's some risk that the audience will suddenly feel like this is not the fun show that I love. On the other hand, I think we all learned from commercial radio in the US, which really overloaded the number of ad spots per hour, and I could spend hours talking about that, but the ad load in the US was like 13 spots an hour at one point. I mean, it was insane. And I think even with modified ad units, we all know that if we go above, 5 spots an hour, 5, 6 spots an hour, you're going to start to run into audience pushback. But the other great thing is the more ads there are, the more appealing an ad-free offering is. So by having that hybrid model of a totally ad-free experience and the free ad-supported experience, you give the consumer some choice, especially if the price point isn't so ludicrous that they're okay with paying it.
I do agree. The more you will have programs with ads, the more it's interesting for subscription model platforms.
Hi, we often compare podcasting with streaming, video streaming, or video platform like Netflix. Do you fear that podcasts can be in the future threatened by piratage?
Actually, since it's majority of podcasts are free today, I think that piratage is not really a threat right now. In the future, if more exclusive podcasts are behind the paywall, well, I don't know.
It really depends on the show. I think it's inevitable that in the US at least, at some point, the market's going to fragment and certain shows are going to end up on certain platforms. But that's been the case with video for forever, frankly. And I don't think that stopped the growth of paid video in the US or ad-supported video. So I think we do have the difficult task of trying to change consumer behavior because you can't make something for free forever. It just doesn't work. So exclusivity, paywall, that's going to happen. On the other hand, there are so many podcasts out there, and there's such a variety that it's really just about finding the right set of shows. And I think once you find the right set of shows, if they're high quality enough, you may pay, you may be willing to go to a certain platform. The way we think about it is we think about groups of audience and how do we serve those groups of audience most effectively, and how do we surround them with enough content that's above and beyond what they could get for free, and also linked to other products, whether it be a merchandise or other experiences, and try and create a world around the consumer as opposed to like trying to take things away from the consumer. That's how we think about it.
Maybe my 2 cents about this. Two differences with piratage in video, especially a few years ago, is that first I think with podcasting, proximity with the host and the producer is great, and I think emotional attachment and really willingness to respect the producer can be higher. And second thing is that back in the days, piratage was also a way to get content that was not easily accessible on platforms, and with podcasts, actually, the availability of the content is great. And if platforms are expanding on the paywall, the paying system, they will try to offer a great user experience, and the convenient way to get the content can be also a justification of paying.
Yep. Yeah, just maybe to give a concrete idea of the audiences. I think that the question was good because I'm sure that thanks to podcasts, we will enrich the relation with some group of people composing our audiences. See, if you take France Culture, for example, we know that you have 40% of the people listening France Culture are listening France Culture only by podcast. And if you take 100 minutes of France Culture, we estimate that between 15 and 20 minutes are listened thanks to the podcast. So it's not marginal. For some channels, it's really a huge evolution, and I am sure that tomorrow we will be able to have a stronger relationship with some groups composing our audiences, which is not the case today.
Fabienne, merci. Eric, thank you very much for traveling from the US. Merci à tous les participants. Merci à vous toutes et à vous tous d'avoir participé à cette première matinée du Festival Média en scène.